Hello everyone, my name is Brenden Groom, and I'll be your host for this episode of Side Quests. A little bit about me before we get into it. I am the host of the Path to Controller podcast, which is a weekly show where we talk about the latest in video games and nerd culture, as well as the editor for pathtocontroller.io, where you can find a lot of our written content, as well as reviews, interviews, and editorials on things going on in nerd culture and video games. You can find me personally at bgroom, where I talk a lot about video games, my cat, beer, and who knows what else. So if that sounds like something that's your cup of tea, feel free to check all of that out. But the game that I wanted to talk about today is a game that is very, very special to me, and that is The Messenger. For those of you who aren't aware of what this game is, it's an indie game developed by a studio out of Canada called Sabotage Studio. And when I first discovered this game, it was, I believe, during a Nintendo Indie World Direct. Actually, at that time, it may have not have been called Indie World and just have been an Indie Direct. But regardless, when I saw it, I mean, you have a game that's, gorgeous looking pixelated graphics with great music. You already have my attention, so it doesn't take too much to get my attention from that. But this game looked great from what they showed, and I then later had a chance to play it for the first time at PAX East in the beginning of 2018. And during that encounter, I actually got to play it with the creator of the game, Thierry Boulanger, who, when him and I sat down to play with it, there was a lot of things that we talked about with that game. And at the time, they were only showing off a very brief portion of the game, but him and I kind of hit it off so well, and I was really enjoying the game, where he asked me if I wanted to see some later game stuff that they weren't really showing on the floor, and I wasn't really allowed to talk about at the time in any of the coverage we were putting up. But he was feeling how I was feeling about it, so I was like, yeah, absolutely. And he warned me, like, hey, there's gonna be some light spoilers for later game things, and I'm like, I need to see this. Like, I can't not see this for you bringing it up. And it just kind of cemented me being really excited about this game. And the thing with The Messenger to me is, it's one of those games, and I'll kind of back my claims up as we get through this episode, but it's one of those games that when I discovered it and played it at PAX East in 2018, it hit me the way the first time I played and saw Shovel Knight hit me, where Shovel Knight to me is like a pillar of indie games and platforming in general. I mean, I think for a long time, Shovel Knight, and still is, I would say, is a benchmark for indie platformers and just platformers in general. And when I had the chance to play The Messenger, when it fully released later in 2018, I think The Messenger then became that type of benchmark, where if you're trying to make an indie platformer or just a platformer in general, if you're not hitting the bars that Shovel Knight and now The Messenger have set, I think you need to maybe go back and rework some of your mechanics or other parts of the game that may not be up to snuff. So when I had the chance to play it and had those feelings, I was a little nervous because I was very hyped up on this game. I was very, very looking forward to it. And, how can something that I'm this hyped up for ever live up to my expectations? And I think not only did it live up to those expectations when I finally got to play the full game, I think it somehow surpassed them, which is not an easy thing to do. And the other thing about The Messenger too is it came out in 2018, where there were a lot of really good indie games that came out. You had Celeste that was winning a bunch of awards and getting a lot of acclaim. You had games like Dead Cells that I know it initially released in a years prior in early access on PC, I believe, but it got its full release across all platforms in 2018, so it became, I would consider that a 2018 release. And you had those two games that were getting a lot of the spotlight, and to me, having played all three, I love Celeste, I love Dead Cells, but The Messenger, I think, was, for me, easily the best game that came out in 2018, the game I enjoyed the most for sure, and a game that I think about and, recommend constantly since. And I still think it's a game that, if you haven't played, you should definitely take the time. It's available at this point. I think when it initially launched in 2018, it was only on Steam and Switch, but it should be available on everything right now. It might even still be on Xbox Game Pass. I know it was at one point, but it's definitely a game that you should absolutely seek out if platformers and, light Metroidvanias are your thing. I think this is something that is definitely in the conversation and needs to be played. But I'm talking all these fantastical things about a game and not really talking about the game too much itself. So I guess I can do that for a little bit too, if you're interested in what The Messenger is all about and why I speak so highly of it, outside of the fact that I just love to champion indie games when I can. So The Messenger, when you're making a platformer, I think that the two main things, especially something that's stylized in a retro aesthetic, I think the two main important things to catch people and to get people invested is it needs to have good controls. It needs to feel tight. It needs to feel responsive. If you're jumping and it doesn't feel right, if you're trying to grab a ledge and it doesn't feel right, if you're trying to attack enemies and it doesn't feel right, that's gonna linger throughout the game, and it's gonna hinder your experience, or maybe hinder you even finishing the game. So at that being said, visually the game is stunning, and control-wise, I think that there are very few games that feel as tight as this to me. Like, this feels like it is a AAA polished, has an abundant amount of resources and money behind it to make sure that time was spent to make sure that it controls as good as it does. Anytime that you die in the game, because the game isn't necessarily easy. It definitely has some challenging moments, especially if you want to 100% the game. Collect everything and whatnot. It definitely has some challenging moments and areas, but I feel like they're balanced because the gameplay is so tight, where when you die 9 times out of 10, if not 10 out of 10 times, it's by your error and not necessarily because there was some sort of issue. You didn't grab a ledge, you didn't bounce off an enemy when you were trying to glide through or what have you. So I definitely feel like when it comes to a game that is polished in controls, this is a 10 out of 10 in that aspect. I think this game is a 10 out of 10 regardless. There are some things that and no game is perfect. Games can be masterpieces without being perfect, because I don't think anything is perfect. But this game to me is definitely a masterpiece, and the controls definitely back that claim up for me. And then the visuals are very special to me, because if you know anything about The Messenger, even without playing it, you probably at least know that there's what some might say is a gimmick, where the game is in the beginning stages, it's in 8-bit, and then at some point there's a transition to 16-bit graphics. They also transition the music to 16-bit when you go into that style. But it's not just a gimmick. I mean, sure, it's a cool visual, thing that can be considered that, but they make sure to tie this whole change from 16-bit to 18-bit back and forth. Oh, I'm sorry, 8-bit back and forth. Is that there's a lot of story elements that are revolved around that, and I am still kind of shocked to this day that the story in The Messenger is actually phenomenal, and the writing and some of the character development and some of the character dialogue is so well written that I think I don't want to really talk about spoiler stuff, because I think that if you have an interest in this game, you should enjoy it for what it is. And maybe you do know what the twist is, and maybe it's not that crazy of a twist, but I like to leave the spoilers off the table for this type of discussion and kind of just talk overall about some of the game on a broader sense. That way, if you do, which I hope you do, end up seeking this game out afterwards, you enjoy your time with it and get to experience it, with as much blindness as I did going in. Well, I guess not as much as I did, because I had some of it revealed to me at PAX East, like I had mentioned earlier. But when you get to that moment where the game opens up this 16-bit situation for you, so up until that point, actually, we'll stick with the 8-bit for now. When you're playing through the 8-bit part of the game, it seems very linear. It's much more platforming, kind of just seems like a Ninja Gaiden-esque game, like a Shinobi game, where you're on a path and you're going this way and you're just moving through. But when you get to that moment when things change, when the story gives you the reasoning why it's changing, and you start going into the 16-bit version of the game, it then opens up the ability to go back and forth between those two styles. Because again, I guess the very, very light part of this that I can say that's not really a spoiler is that the transition between 8-bit and 16-bit is like a time travel mechanic, which then changes not just the game from 8-bit to 16-bit stylized, it changes the type of game it is. So when you're going into 16-bit, it then opens this game up to be a little bit more of a Metroidvania, where you're going back to areas you've already been to, where you're looking for things in past areas, you're backtracking a decent amount to find certain things. And now that you have this ability going through time, you're able to see certain areas and see certain things in a different way that you couldn't see when you were in 8-bit. So I enjoy that a lot. I think I would have personally been fine with it too, even if it didn't connect it to a story and it was just a mechanic in the game. But I think the Sabotage Studio taking that extra step to make it more meaningful, to me, is even better. Even though I don't think it necessarily needed to have that, but I think that makes it an even better mechanic, that it's tied into the story of the game, to the lore of the game. So that was really cool in my opinion. I think for someone who loves video games with good music too, the thing that's cool when you switch between the two dimensions is that the music also, the soundtrack, which is a fantastic soundtrack made by Rainbow Dragon Eyes, is a soundtrack that there's basically all of the game in 8-bit style and then all of that same music redone in 16-bit using the tools that would be accessible to people making games at that time. So they're very true to their what they're trying to pay homage to. So I really enjoy the music across the game. One little thing about the music that stood out to me that I loved so much, and it's a little thing but it's just something I like to mention: when you go underwater in certain sections of the game, the music also reflects that, and it gets like sort of muffled as if you were underwater yourself listening to the music. And it's something small, it's just a little detail, but it's really cool to me. Like I like that just little attention to detail that didn't need to be there, but the fact that it's there is just it's something cool, it's something special. To get back to the story too, the story does a lot of interesting things, and I resonated with me a lot, and I enjoyed what was there. And like I said, I didn't necessarily need that to be there, but I'm very happy with the fact that they made this very, very interesting story and world and characters. Probably the two most memorable characters to me are the shopkeeper and Quarble. So like I said before, this is a sort of challenging game at times, and you definitely will die often. And when you die, you have this little companion with you named Quarble, who every time you die and get a death screen, he has like a little quip to say to you, and it's funny. Like the writing on those parts are pretty good. I screenshotted them on my Switch far too often, probably shared them far too often when I was playing the game in 2018. But those moments are great. And then the shopkeeper, who you run into a lot, he's a pretty important aspect of the story. He pushes the story along for you, and he helps you. Obviously, he sells you things and whatnot. But he has a lot of lore things as well that you can optionally choose to go through with him. But a lot of the things that he does and says are pretty great, and he's very well written. And I think just another layer of this game has so many facets to it that I think if you removed all those things, it would still be a great game. Like I still think that if it was just this very polished platformer Metroidvania that had really good controls and great style and great music, it would be a great game. But the fact that it has all of this other stuff, great writing, great story, it ties the mechanics, that big mechanic into the story and the world, I think that stuff is what pushes this over the limit to being a masterpiece, being a benchmark for anyone else looking to make this style of game. Definitely for me makes it something very special. But yeah, I don't want to dip too much into the story specifically, just because I feel like it's something that could it could offer a little bit of twists, a little bit of we'll just leave it at that. I don't want to talk about the story in depth, just because I don't want to spoil anything potentially for someone who may want to experience this without knowing too much about what's going on. But for me, like I had said through and through, this is a game that I think is the current benchmark for platformers. It's definitely one of the greatest games I have ever played. I would put it on my top 10 list of video games, definitely in my top 10 list of indie games for sure. And it's something that I think, like I said, if you like platformers, if you like Metroidvanias, I think this is a game that you should absolutely seek out. It's available pretty much everywhere that you can play games, maybe not mobile, but it should be on all of the major consoles as well as PCs. So if you have any interest in the Messenger, if you want to take my word for it, I will put my stamp on this, saying that it is by far one of the best games I've ever played, and something that will stay with me for a very, very long time. And if you end up loving the Messenger, that same studio, Sabotage Studio, is working on a new game that is set in the universe of The Messenger, but it's a different type of game. It's an RPG called Sea of Stars. I don't think it has a release date yet, but if you do love The Messenger like I do, you can look forward to checking out Sea of Stars in the future and get more of that delicious world, because let me tell you, I love it. And you know what? It's funny because in 2018, Celeste, Dead Cells, and The Messenger all came out, and then I believe it all happened in the same year too. All three of those games got free updates that added additional content. So for The Messenger, there's an additional little campaign called Picnic Panic that's more story, more levels, more to that game. And it's, if you download The Messenger, if you already have The Messenger, you have that for free. So there's a lot more game there than what initially was already there, which was already a good beefy game that I highly recommend. And if you have any issues with The Messenger, I can't help you because I love it, and I think it's like I said over and over, it's one of the best games that I've ever played, and I hope you do check it out. And that's all I gotta say about The Messenger. If you want to keep up with me or you want to talk to me about The Messenger, you can check me out at bgroom on Twitter or listen to our podcasts. And I hope you have a wonderful day. Happy gaming.